Hey, thanks for everyone for coming today, everybody in the room and everybody online. We're really happy to have Branda Nowell to give us a presentation. This is kind of her final presentation as part of her ORI fellowship. Some of you may remember we had a couple of post-COVID task force committees that happened post-COVID. And several topics were identified out of those task force, one of which was a need to better understand interdisciplinary initiatives and how to support those and grow those at the university. And so ORI posted this initiative and this idea as one of the fellowship opportunities. And Branda applied for the fellowship. And so we're really excited to have her here today to present on that. And for those of you who don't know her, she's a professor in public administration in the School of Public Administration, International and
Public International.
Thank you, Public International. We're really excited and appreciate all the work that you've done, and I've enjoyed working with you over the past year. And so look forward to hearing your talk today.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming, some of you for the second time. It's great to see everyone and for the opportunity just to kind of pull all of this stuff together. It's been this has been a really interesting project. So my background disciplinarily is organizational and community psychology. And so you're going to see a lot of stuff coming out of this. It's sort of like how an organizational psychologist kind of thinks about what institutional structure looks like and how we might consider it in these different kinds of ways, and what that means for how it is as an institution we can better support initiatives that go into this heading of interdisciplinary initiatives here at NC State. So my area of specialization is on institutional design and complex problem domains, and I do a lot of work in networks and network governance. So this was sort of right up my alley. I was very interested in, as I was watching some of the evolution of all the cool stuff that was happening here, sort of how it is that we sort of bring this stuff together and connect across different disciplinary boundaries is a question that I've been interested in for some time. So this was a really fun opportunity to kind of get to look at my own institution. I've done some consulting work with this with other institutes of higher education, and this was an opportunity to really kind of get to learn a lot about NC State and all the nifty stuff that we have going on here, as well as to kind of put that lens onto it. So this was the project Fostering Interdisciplinary Initiatives at NC State University. And this was a collaboration between the Office of Research and Innovation, as well as the Office of University Interdisciplinary Programs. And so the project goals start out as understanding what the origins of successful interdisciplinary initiatives at NC State looked like. So where did these come from? How did they grow into what they were? How are they organized in terms of their structure, operations, and finances? So kind of that diagnostic lens of sort of what do they look like? How do we organize them? What are their business models? Those sorts of things. And then what are some of the developmental challenges that interdisciplinary initiatives have to overcome in order to become successful? And so we did a comparative case study of 17 successful interdisciplinary initiatives at NC State University. And so that's an important sort of caveat, I guess, of the findings that I'm going to be presenting. So this is the winner's circle, and that was intentional by design. So we were really interested in initiatives that had kind of gotten themselves established enough to at least get on this list. And this list was jointly prepared between the Office of Research and Innovation and the Office of University Interdisciplinary Programs, in terms of just sort of larger initiatives that had sort of gotten themselves fairly established within the university. And so that was really our focus. I did interviews with leaders, but ideally with folks who were sort of originating leaders of these initiatives. I reviewed financial reports and then did just sort of archival review of websites and other documentation. So this is the list of initiatives that I got to speak with. So as you can see, it's a very diverse group all over campus. I got to learn about all sorts of cool stuff that I had no idea that we were even doing. Yeah, so much appreciation for the folks who spent their time talking to me and contributing to this project. All right, so the first set of findings related to this was sort of what I call what's in the bucket, because there was this term, and this oftentimes happens in organizations where we start to call things, and then we all nod knowingly at each other as though we know what those things are, when in fact, what those things are actually may look very, very different. And so we have this thing called interdisciplinary initiatives at NC State University, but there's actually a lot of diversity that goes into that. So, and so I was looking at this very much from not in any way thinking about it in terms of the sort of the labeling strategies that we use in terms of what we call things. I basically took those all away. I didn't pay any attention to whether something was called an initiative or a center or an academy or anything like that. I basically just looked at it through the lens of like, what is this thing? How is it, where is it structured? Who is its stakeholders? What's this, what's the business model that it operates on? Those sorts of things. So looking kind of in a very cross-cutting way. So you're going to see everything is kind of piled together and then broken apart in a slightly different way here, not in any way to influence the sort of naming conventions that we're using for these things, but to really give us some adjectives for being able to describe things, regardless of what we call them, to be able to describe what they are. So this is the kind of what's in the bucket of this thing we call interdisciplinary initiatives. And so one of the things that I started to do, because there was a lot of diversity across these things, is I started to think in terms of archetypes. Was there kind of these, and archetypes work in an institutional sense, kind of the way personality inventories work. You kind of want to give them a little bit of a, put a whole lot of weight in them. There tends to be a lot more diversity, but then even those that across, but they give us a way to sort of think about differences and variety that may have different logics in how these groups are working. And so I started to think about archetypes in terms of the relation. And so there's several different aspects of diversity that I looked at in this project. This archetypes was specifically thinking about the relationship of I'm going to use the word initiative to talk about everything here. So just take all other naming conventions off the table. We're calling everything an initiative for right now. Thinking about the initiative in its relationship to its funder, in relationship to the product, output, or service that it's producing, and in relationship to the departments and colleges, because that is sort of the macro organizational structure of the university. So thinking about those. And so what I identified was 4 to then 5, because we have a hybrid one that I'm going to show in here. But the first one is kind of the traditional. And this is when I came to the project, what I was thinking about is these initiatives. So traditional centers, these are like historically rooted in NSF grants and NIH grants. And there's a lot of external funders that fund this sort of thing. And so this is the one you tend to think of, where you have a funder that has this thing that they want to fund around the center, and that gets funding into the institution. The departments and colleges oftentimes are contributing faculty expertise into that, and we're sort of organizing around some thematic areas, and then we're producing something out of that, generally some sort of academic output. So we're talking in terms of the publications, and the findings, and the patents, and the things that are coming out of that. So that's our traditional center. Very familiar. A version of that is a client center. So these tend to be more externally oriented into industries. And so, and I'll actually give, let me just get you in some examples here. So Center for Educational Informatics. So this is a very traditional center. I think it's 100% funded through NSF money, if I recall right. And yeah, very, very traditional kind of center structure, as I've talked about. North Carolina Institute for Climate Studies. We apparently create all of the science for the National Climate Assessment. Did you guys know that? I didn't know that before I did that. Oh, that's kind of cool. This is a client-based initiative. So we have one major client with this. It is the US government. I think it's funded through NOAA. I'm remembering right. Sorry, it's been a minute since I've had all these interviews. But I believe NOAA is the primary funder for that. And so they are a major client. We do other stuff within this institute, but that is the major purpose of why this institute exists, is to produce the science for this particular client. We also have other versions of this, like that are a little bit more hybrid-y, where, for example, like Assist does a lot of work client-oriented, working for use cases in industry. So it has a very strong client emphasis in terms of how it's structured and set up. We also have some member types of initiatives. So if you go back here, so here's our client, where basically the funder and the recipient of the information is the same person. This is essentially the difference there. Membership is where we have just a few of these. The one that kind of stands out is the IBM Quantum Hub. And so this is an initiative that's trying to kind of solve that chicken and egg issue with technological innovation, where you need to get the technology into people's hands to figure out how you can innovate with it, to then create use cases, to then build it. So we host the IBM Quantum Hub, and so we sell quantum computing space for people to engage with, and technical assistance for for them to do that. And so we have, the membership in this case could be somebody internal to the university vis-a-vis the colleges and departments. So departments and colleges, creates this capacity for the university researcher community to take advantage of it. But we also have external memberships into the Quantum Hub. So industry, for example, may buy quantum computing. I can't remember what it's called, a Q something. That we sell, and that comes with a series of a suite of technical assistance for folks to sort of embed, help think through opportunities to use quantum computing to advance different industries. So that's a membership. So people pay sort of a pay as you go kind of model on things, whether you're internal to university or external. And then we have these core capability models. So the data science is for everyone. So this is one in which the funding is coming in and really the users and the departments are one and the same thing. So it's really trying to infuse some sort of capability throughout our larger architecture of the university. And like I said, data science, similar, working in some ways like to how like the libraries operate, where it's this sort of general capability that tries to have a very diffused impact across all the structure of the university. And then we have a fifth one that I couldn't figure out exactly where to do. I started calling it the internally curated platform. So this is somewhat of a linkage between a traditional center and an internal and a core capability model, where essentially what we do is we set these up. They work very much like a traditional center in terms of you usually have thematic groupings that are working around them. So they're trying to advance research and scholarship and innovation in certain core areas. They're pulling faculty in that are affiliating with the initiative around those core areas, but it's much more integrated into the college and department structure. And so these operate slightly differently. I think the base, I guess the parent model for this was the Comparative Medicine Institute that was incubated in the College of Veterinary Sciences and now has broadened out from there. And from there, we have like the PSI initiative. Global One Health is a little bit different from that because it's in the academy structure, but it sort of came out of some of that idea. So this operate a little bit different than a center. They tend to be more decentralized. There tends to be like, for example, like return to F&A in a center oftentimes goes back to the center. In these models, they tend to go back out to the departments and colleges. It operates in a slightly different way because it's trying to, I think, become much more decentralized in solving some of the previous challenges that we've had with centers. So this is an interesting model that we've seen grow up here as well. All right, so that's one. So the archetypes is sort of one way that you could slice and dice and think about the different categories of these initiatives that are going on around campus. Another way is to think about it in terms of how broad versus targeted is the scope of the practice of what it is that they're trying to do. And then their change model. How much are they focused on executing sort of an internal locus? So bringing things into the initiative, into the center, into the thing, and creating the sensor, creating the scholarship, building the patent, doing the things in-house that then go out? Or are they working on enabling models, which is where you're trying to get other people to do things? And you're trying to get that capability embedded in other institutional places around campus. So this executing versus enabling in terms of their change model, and the targeted versus broad was also something that was very different across all of these different initiatives. And if you kind of map these in a very back of the napkin kind of way, the one thing that seemed to be important is that there is a bit of a linear relationship here. So the more broad that an initiative is in terms of its scope and its mission, what it's trying to do, the more it tends to transition towards more of an enabling approach. So something that's trying to be very broad is oftentimes trying to execute what it's doing through the institution, through different features of the institution at the university, as opposed to trying to pull stuff in-house. So in-house initiatives tended to be a little bit more narrow in scope, and the enabling ones tended to have a broader mission. So that was just important to think about. So here's just some exemplars. So Data Science Academy was probably the broadest, as well as the most enabling. Yeah.
What are the units on the axis?
So I took the units off of that. Well, I guess they actually are on there. I had a scale and I had a series of key informants sort of rate the initiatives in how broad versus narrow they thought the scope was and how. So and how much they focused on executing versus enabling change management plan. So this is very back of the napkin kind of stuff. So. And then, I think this might be the last one, is to think about the proximate change targets. So what is it an initiative's trying to do? Who is it trying to, what's its mission? Who is it trying to influence? And particularly in terms of its most proximate, the things that it's trying to have the most direct influence on. So some of our initiatives are very internally focused. So the focus of the change model is really on trying to create new knowledge with students and faculty and departments, and sort of indirectly through that influencing intellectual domains through the students that we're graduating and the postdocs that we're working with and the literature that's been coming out from those initiatives. So those I would consider more of our internally focused initiatives. Some of them are much more externally focused. So their proximate change targets are policymakers and clients and industries and communities. And so this internal versus external focus is something that we saw as varying across the different initiatives. And then I guess there's ones that we can't forget money. So they do also vary in terms of what their business models look like and what the portfolio looks like. Almost all of our initiatives had a combination of different types of support that range from university, college, and external funding. And so depending on sort of the type of initiative it was, it tended to have a different kind of portfolio in terms of what its business model looked like, particularly related to direct versus indirect support for it. And so you can kind of think about this in terms of just, again, back of the napkin. This is not from a scientific perspective, but from a strategic perspective, just starting to think about, okay, what kind of initiative is this? How is it going to be organized vis-a-vis its funders and the departments and colleges? What's the mission scope in terms of how broad versus narrow is it? What is the change model that they're working on? Are they trying to execute the stuff in-house? Are they trying to get other people, other parts of the institution to be able to do the work that needs to happen? What's the business model for these types of initiatives? And who are their approximate change targets? So these are all just ways to kind of start to think about what an initiative is, and therefore, why, so the questions are like, why would anyone go to the trouble to do that? That seems like a lot of work. The point being here is that depending on what an initiative is trying to be and do, it may need different kinds of supports. And so this is an approach to sort of move away from if a one size fits all starts to feel problematic, we may need to start thinking about, okay, well, are there different ways to think about supporting different types of initiatives? Maybe not all initiatives need exactly the same kind of support. Maybe different types of initiatives need different kinds of things. So it's a way to start to have those types of conversations. So when we think about institutionally supporting interdisciplinary initiatives, that may not look the same for every single initiative based on what the initiative is, what it's trying to do, where it's trying to be, et cetera. The other thing that's really important about that is that because of these different aspects, these are all like core aspects of institutional design, and institutional design infers institutional logic. So institutional logics is a geeky way of saying why things happen the way they do and people think the way they think in a certain institutional context, right? It's the rules that govern why things work the way they do in certain places differently than other places. And so when we're thinking about initiatives that are trying to do very, very different things, they're very likely to develop different types of institutional logics about them. And so if we're thinking about trying to work within that context and support them, and also support them in the context of the university, one of the things that folks talk about, like, why is it so hard to do interdisciplinary work? It's like, well, it's hard to do interdisciplinary work because the macro structure and logic of the university is based on disciplinary excellence. And we have to make eye contact with that. The entire departmental collegiate structure is based on disciplinary excellence. That's what it was originally set up to do. That is the driving logic of that structure. And so when we're embedding interdisciplinary work into that, it's going to have to work within that logic, right? And so you're dealing with competing logics that are trying to kind of figure out how to work together. And so when we're talking about doing that, we're talking about kind of three different strategic things: balancing, braiding, and buffering. So balancing is to just recognize that anytime you're adding something new to the portfolio, you are now going to have to kind of shift priorities a little bit, right? Because now you're having to balance something else into the set of priorities. That oftentimes is the least fun bit of it, because that's the kind of fixed pie types of stuff. Braiding has to do with finding complementarity. It's figuring out how new things can actually help to create complementarity and synergies with what you already have and vice versa. So how is it that you can create sort of synergistic relationships with the existing logics that you've got with the new things that you're trying to build, so that they're not necessarily, there's always going to be a bit of a structural competition with them, but you also want them to be complementary with them. And so finding those sorts of opportunities. And then buffering is an important strategic piece when you've got something new that you're trying to do. Generally, by definition, that means your institution is not going to be set up to do that. And so oftentimes you need to kind of give it some protected space to grow up and figure out what it's going to be before you can kind of release it back into the, into the barnyard with the rest of the animals. So it can kind of hold its own. So buffering and allowing some new stuff to kind of get incubated and come into some level of maturity before sort of so that it can kind of figure out where it's going to fit within that larger institutional structure. So that's what we think about a lot when we're thinking about sort of adding new institutional aspects. So here's just an example of stuff that came out of the interviews with folks in terms of differences in how different initiatives are designing themselves vis-a-vis their colleges and departments. So this was a common thing that talked about in terms of like, how is it the initiative is sort of orienting itself relative to this other macro structure that is already very established and very important at NC State. Interdisciplinarity doesn't make a whole lot of sense as excellence if we don't have disciplinary excellence as well, right? And at the same time, if all we do is care about disciplinary excellence, we're going to become, the ability to actually make progress on some complex issues is going to be really limited. So these two things actually need each other in complementation, but how they do that depends on what they are in terms of initiatives. So on our most self-contained outward oriented, so this would be the buffering strategy. This is where the logic of the university may be significantly out of alignment with, for example, the logic of an industry that you're trying to engage with. And so you need to create some sort of buffer between the university and the industry so that the initiative can actually function in that boundary space. So in our boundary spanning initiatives that are really trying to link us to external industries, external stakeholders, policymakers, communities, those sorts of things, oftentimes that's where we need the most buffering kind of work, because those logics are oftentimes not very well aligned and they're not very compatible. And so there's a whole lot of design options for doing that. So you may hire research scientists that are not affiliated with departments so that they can just focus specifically on the initiative. You may hire professional staff affiliated with the initiative. You may develop contractual fee-for-service arrangements associated with the initiative. You may physically locate the initiative off campus to maximize exposure to your industry partners. You may make initiative resources available to members and clients only. So these are all kind of buffering, more externally oriented types of design choices that some of our initiatives have done. On the other end of the continuum is where you really want to embed deeply into the collegiate and departmental structure, right? So this is where you may establish faculty area directors or faculty fellows programs to engage departmental faculty. Oftentimes there's a lot of focus on returning F&A to departments, so making sure the resources are sort of flowing between the initiatives and the collegiate structure. You're going to be working through college business units on these. Physically embedding the initiative activities within the colleges themselves, making the initiative resources broadly available to the university stakeholders. So that's kind of the other end of the continuum. And then there's a whole bunch of middle stuff, right? So cluster hires, for example, is a great example of sort of this mid-level strategy where we're going to hire faculty and we're going to jointly appoint them to both an initiative, the cluster, and their department, right? To pull those pieces together. Administering grants through ORI, making initiative resources available to targeted groups of stakeholders, offering competitive mini grants to engage faculty and students. So those are all kind of those more mid-level types of structures. So these designs are not like, there's not a good design or a bad design. There's just fit. Like, is it a good fit for what the initiative is trying to do? All right, so now transitioning to, that's kind of, there's just the description and thinking about how do we describe what these things are and what those, how do we make sense of what those differences might look like? This was more kind of stepping back a little bit in scope and thinking about broadly at NC State, how do we support the development of interdisciplinary initiatives? And so first I wanted to just share some of the strengths as well as challenges that folks shared with me through these interviews. There's a lot of excitement and energy around interdisciplinary initiatives at NC State. It's people who are involved in these things tend to be very, very positive about that. I think NC State has a lot to be proud of in how it's been able to sort of organize some of the initiatives and do some of the cross-cutting work that it has. And so, you know, some of the strengths that folks who are embedded in this, so that, again, these are the leaders of these initiatives who helped grow them through, you know, they talk about that there's a clear institutional commitment to doing this kind of work, even though it's hard and there's, you know, bumps in the road. People really felt like NC State is trying to figure it out and really committed to that. The cluster hire program was repeatedly identified as being critical because this creates sort of the intellectual workforce for bringing these interdisciplinary areas into life, and sort of creating the logic for different departments and programs and their students to participate in them. They talked a lot about the proven track record for working with non-university partners. We were on Centennial campus. We have this very innovative place. We can physically co-locate with industries and other partners that are outside of the university, and that's really important. We have cutting edge physical infrastructure here. And people talked about the growth opportunities for interdisciplinary leaders. I think for a lot of folks, particularly if you're interested in these sort of boundary spanning spaces, it's created a really rich environment for folks that I think have felt really rewarding. Brain expanding, I think was one of my favorite quotes on that. There was that first question, like, where did these initiatives that were successful that made it to the winner's circle came from? It turned out with all the diversity that I just went through and all the different ways in which these have grown up and looked up and what they look like, they all come from exactly the same spot. At least two of the following three in all of them, and in most cases three. They all had a college level incubator and or a significant funder. And then they all had a strategic initiative of the university as well. So if you want to be successful, you need these three things, at least two of these three things. You can make it with two, three is better. And so this is where the winner's circle came from. Almost all of them had some sort of external funding, not all though. If they didn't, they generally had either a strategic initiative by the university leadership or a college level incubator. So that was an interesting thing, that regardless of the diversity, they all pretty much came from the same place here. And there were several sort of cross-cutting challenges that folks talked to me about. And so, you know, there's ongoing challenges, even though there was a lot of talk about, we've made a lot of progress. You know, apparently in the 1970s, if you were in one department, you just couldn't take classes from any other department. It was just not even an allowed thing. So we've made a lot of progress in enabling interdisciplinarity, but there's still some challenges. So structural and cultural disincentives for interdisciplinarity, unclear business models for sustainability and metrics of success. And I think this is one of the key things, particularly related to the diversity of the initiative types. So there's not a clear way to sort of think of it. For a lot of these initiatives, the leaders described sort of a lot of uncertainty about what does good look like at the end of the day, end of the year. What's the plan in terms of, is this going to go on forever? Particularly those that are receiving a significant amount of university support for them. It was unclear to a lot of leaders about, is that going to go forever? Is it not? Is there a transition plan? Do I need to do I need to figure out how to transition this into some sort of external funding? Does that even make sense given the kind of initiative that I am? Those sorts of things. So I think there was a lot of uncertainty that is a struggle for a lot of these leaders. Lack of an integrated strategy and transparency in terms of pathways of support. So there's some serendipity that happens, I think, with some of these initiatives as it was described to me. And so folks there was some discussion about that in terms of when and how support can be garnered. And lack of enabling institutional systems and infrastructure. Again, when we're trying to do things new, generally that means that none of the systems are going to be set up well to do that, right? Because we're trying to do something new. And so that's going to start stressing out a lot of systems. It stresses out the HR systems, it stresses out the technology systems, the space, all the things. You guys all know this. And so sort of the ability to kind of help shepherd new things along through those pieces in ways that make it less painful for both the initiative leaders who are trying to run all these things and had never even knew that they had to get into the Kenny system and redefine all their program codes. And also for the systems themselves that are trying to catch up with the whatever thing is coming down the pipeline. All right, so this all kind of led, and this gets where I kind of took a step back and was like, okay, so what do I think this means? Because I assume that was probably going to be one of the questions that folks asked about it. Is thinking about sort of what would be a framework then for how we think about institutionally supporting these types of initiatives. And so I started thinking about this as harnessing the power of organized anarchies. I was reading a lot about organized anarchies, which is really fun literature to be part of. So these are basically strategic decision spaces governed by serendipity, equifinality, and cultivated opportunity rather than linear design. And they are an appealing metaphor, if nothing else, because of the fact that innovation is infinitely difficult to top-down mandate, right? It's very hard to tell somebody to be brilliant. And so you really, you know, at an institutional level, you really are sort of trying to capture things as they're coming and get behind them and help them grow. And that's a big challenge at the top-down level of the institution. And at the sort of bottom-up level, it's very hard if you've got something very cool to sort of get it big enough that it can start to stand on its own without crushing the people that are designing these things. So this was the framework that I had proposed, that it's sort of a 4-stage, sort of we can work in 4 different quadrants of institutional capacity building and enabling. And I was, you know, I've been hanging out with my CNR colleagues a lot, so you know, I've got compost on environmental metaphors on my brain. So I thought about it in terms of churning and enriching the compost, incubating fledgling initiatives, supporting the transition to some sort of sustainable institutional asset, and then facilitating the evolution into something new. And so, and we're doing work in all of these. I would say we've got a lot more work in the first 2 than we do in the later 2. So in terms of churning and enriching the compost, we've got a lot going on in this. I would say this is where we've spent a ton of energy lately, where we're focused on diversifying the talent of folks interested in interdisciplinary work. So this would be like the cluster hires initiative, identifying and addressing institutional barriers and disincentive to interdisciplinary collaboration. So lots of work that's going on there. I know there's like a policy committee right now that's working through some ideas and trying to understand sort of what is it about the system that's sort of creating friction points with these interdisciplinary initiatives, because the devil's always in the details on institutional design. And creating opportunities for, again, this sort of serendipity to happen for people who were trained to ask and answer questions in different ways to come together and think about a common thing and sort of find those points of intersection and innovation that that sort of leverages their collective perspectives on things. So we're doing a lot of great work in this area right now. In the second quadrant, incubating fledgling initiatives, this is, you know, thinking about a lot of these initiatives were incubated in college level incubators. So college leadership played a really big role in several of these initiatives, actually a number of these initiatives, and sort of helping them get off the ground. And that seems like a really important place to start. And I don't know how much we're working right now with our college leadership in terms of really thinking about like how at the college level do we institutionally support this kind of work, and what is it that would look like. But that the role of the colleges, I think, cannot be underemphasized in this in terms of sort of creating some of that space for some of this work to move forward. Increasing transparency and pathways to growth. So helping folks know if you want to pursue something, here's what a few pathways for pursuing that might look like. Establishing programs for interdisciplinary leader mentoring and coaching on institutional design. So several of my leaders talked about, you know, having to figure out everything for themselves every single time, that even though this had clearly been thought of, somebody else had hit this challenge before, but there just wasn't a lot of things to help them sort of get through the process. They were having to really sort of dig in. And so the burden on the leaders who were trying to shepherd these initiatives forward was very, very high. And so trying to sort of get behind them and add some mentoring and coaching about how people might want to think about setting these initiatives up and moving them forward. And another option would be like establishing university system liaisons. So folks that could help shuttle new initiatives and help that intersection with, you know, all of the different service units that go into support what these initiatives are, the HR, the technology, the space, you name it. Supporting transition to more sustainable institutional assets. This I don't think we're doing much that I know. I didn't hear much about this in my conversations with the leaders. But this might be things like offering technical support in strategic and sustainability planning. So once you've got the grant, you know, the grants tend to be a 5-year grant. What happens is the plan to do it for 5 years and then sunset it? Because that's perfectly reasonable if that's the plan. There's lots of initiatives that do that. But if the plan is something bigger than that, like thinking through what that might look like. So once something is sort of set up, thinking through like, okay, what's the 5 to 10 year plan on this looking like? Clarifying expectations on mid and long-term funding and associated business models. A lot of these initiatives, they sort of were able to get to where they got to because there was university support associated with that. And it's not clear whether that university support is something they're going to be able to count on moving forward. You strategically as a leader have to deal with things very differently, depending on what you think your business model is going to look like. And so leaders really need help sort of understanding what's the possibilities there. And obviously, it's always great to make the resource pie bigger. So expanding university resources and strengthening governance mechanisms to share ownership and investment into these initiatives across. We have a very decentralized university here. And so we have resources at all levels. And so there may be opportunities to sort of expand on some of those as well. And then the last one is one I don't think that's much on anyone's radar unless they've been through an initiative that has sunsetted. So I talked to several leaders who had been part of prior initiatives that had sunsetted and were a bit frustrated because they're like, we did all this stuff. We built all this stuff. We built all this institutional capacity and these relationships and all this stuff. And then the grant ended and we all did something else. And it just kind of was allowed to dissipate. All of that capacity went nowhere. In their description of it. And so there's I think a missed opportunity at the institution level of figuring out like if something is going to sunset, what can we capture out of that? So thinking about coaching and technical assistance in the advance of a sunset of a significant initiative about, okay, well, what can be transitioned out of that? Even if the initiative itself is going to sunset, like are there things that we can transition out to take advantage of? Thinking about the change management plans, sometimes that's a very painful process, sort of taking a large initiative apart is almost as painful as birthing one. And so really sort of helping initiative leaders in that transition process, sending very clear signals if that is about to happen, and talking with folks about that in terms of institutional support, and just celebrating the contributions of these initiatives, even if they are sunsetting, so that we kind of have that as a culture of possibility. And that's what I have for y'all.